viewing through the live stream and the audience that we have here to our first lecture of the fall 2021 semester. So this event is co-sponsored with the university libraries at the University of Memphis, along with the departments of English and the departments of history. And I'd just like to thank you for their support and for helping organize this. Before we get started, I want to tell you a little bit about the Marcus Orr Center. We're named in honor of Dr. Marcus Orr, who is one of the university's most influential and beloved history professors. Try to build on his legacy by asking challenging questions about the things that most define our humanity. We do that through a number of initiatives on campus. We offer undergraduate scholarships in support of burgeoning humanities scholars. We support graduate and faculty fellowship programs for outstanding humanities scholars on our campus. We offer a range of free workshops and professional development training seminars for students, faculty, and the general public, both on campus and throughout Memphis. But our premier program is our evening lecture series, which is back in person this semester for the first time in 2 years, where we feature prominent and provocative thinkers from universities across the country and across the globe, like our lecture tonight by Dr. Phillip Gordon. So we have a number of great events planned for the rest of the semester, which I just want to give a little bit of shout out to. So November 11th, we're going to have a roundtable featuring Joan Wallach Scott, who's a professor emerita from the Institute for Advanced Studies, on the recent backlash against critical race theory and feminist theory and other humanist critiques. And then on November 18th, we'll welcome Rob Nixon, who teaches at Princeton University, and he's going to discuss how the campaign for environmental justice informs some of the most pressing issues of our times, including demands for racial justice and the COVID-19 pandemic. And because of the continuing impact of COVID, all of our events this year are accessible through live streams like the one maybe you're watching right now. And as always, they're free of charge and open to anyone. So I encourage you to check that stuff out on our website. Okay, so with that shameless plug for my own stuff out of the way, let me introduce our speaker. Phillip Gordon is Associate Professor of English and Gay Studies Coordinator at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, where he became the first faculty member to receive the P.B. Poorman Award for outstanding contributions to the UW system on behalf of LGBTQ communities. He's written on topics ranging from recent gay and lesbian young adult novels to Alice Walker and the AIDS narrative, and he's currently writing a book on trans studies approaches to William Faulkner. Tonight, though, he'll share with us work related to his recent book, Gay Faulkner, Uncovering a Homosexual Presence in Yoknapatawpha and Beyond, published by the University of Mississippi Press, where he argues, and I'm quoting here, Faulkner's life and novels can be read as a kind of gay history, certainly for Mississippi, probably for the South, and maybe even for America. So how this is going to go is that Dr. Gordon is going to present his material for 45 minutes or so, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A. I'm going to ask a couple questions, but if anyone either watching live has something they'd like to ask Dr. Gordon, they can drop it in the comments, or anyone live can just ask the question. And with that, let me introduce Dr. Gordon, who I found out is a Memphian. So let's welcome him back to his hometown. Hopefully happily welcome him back to his hometown.
And to our wonderfully small, intimate crowd here, give me a moment. I'm going to pull up a PowerPoint that I swear I'm not just going to read from. So as introductions go. Yes, please. Oh, there we go. Yay. As introductions go, I very much appreciate the introduction to the book, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here to speak. I published this book in January of 2020, and in March of 2020, I had this wonderful 2-week-long book tour planned in Mississippi and all these bookstores and these signings. I don't know if you have many memories that far back from March of 2020, but something happened. And sort of like things took a turn. And so all those events, of course, were postponed or otherwise canceled. And over the past couple of months, I've had the opportunity to speak about the book and about the research behind it, which is always a bit of a challenge. This book project, in terms of like writing the first part of it to its publication, was over 10 years of work. It took on many different forms and faced a number of challenges of people not thinking that there could be a book-length project that approached a topic like homosexuality in the works of William Faulkner. But I was convinced that it could happen. And when push came to shove, I submitted a somewhat hefty baby to the University Press of Mississippi, ranging in at about 160,000 words. That got cut down to 140,000 words. That is part biography, part history, part queer theory, and part cultural studies. Oh, and it dabbles a little bit in literary analysis as well. So as someone who has spoken on the book in other settings, obviously, I have so much to say about it. But I also, it can be a challenge to figure out how to best introduce people to some of the key concepts because it's just too much to sort of go over all the arguments here. Especially as I live in a world now where people are, well, how do I say this nicely? Less likely to have read William Faulkner these days than in the past. Of my audience members here, how many of you who are not a PhD of some kind have read Faulkner? Yay. Oh, that's awesome. That's more people than last night. And I had a bigger crowd there. So trying to get people to understand why Faulkner is important and then why it's important to think about Gay Faulkner becomes a challenge because Faulkner is at this moment in our sort of understanding of the American literary canon still central to it. But if people aren't reading them, then what is the point of still talking about Faulkner these days? And so trying to figure out the best way to approach this topic for an audience has always been a challenge. So what I'm going to do today is lay out sort of two parts of a talk here. The first is a general overview of what is Gay Faulkner, which is not the same as asking the question, was Faulkner gay? There is more of an epistemological approach that I'm taking here, and I want to sort of lay out where that's coming from and what its goals are. And then I'm going to spend the second half of the talk going through a very small set of examples of the types of things that Gay Faulkner has uncovered, that this project uncovered in archives, and trying to do analyses that took an approach that was looking for evidence of LGBTQ connections of some kind in the works of this Nobel Prize winning author who's at the apex of the American literary canon and wrote something like 21 or 22 books that are novels and hundreds of short stories. Like there's a lot to unpack. But before I get into all that, I would be remiss to not start this evening by bringing up the date, the auspiciousness of speaking about LGBTQ issues on October 6th. On October 6th, 1998, in a town called Laramie in Wyoming, a 21-year-old college student named Matthew Shepard walked into a bar, got to talking to a couple of guys who determined that they thought he was a homosexual. They basically lured him out to their truck. They drove him to a field on the edge of town, and they tied him to a fence post and violently beat him. In the process, they fractured his skull by pistol whipping him. He was found on the morning of October 7th, 1998. He was transported to Fort Collins, Colorado, to the medical center there, where he died of his injuries on October 12th. And it's October 6th now, 23 years later. But every year on October 6th and 7th, I try to pause and think about a legacy of someone like Matthew Shepard, who federal hate crimes legislation is actually named after Matthew Shepard, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Federal Hate Crimes Act. That Matthew Shepard is certainly not the only queer person who has been victimized, who has been killed, but he became a symbol in LGBTQ plus communities of the importance of fighting for our rights in this sort of new frame, post-Stonewall, post-AIDS crisis. And as an interesting side note, at the time that this occurred, we didn't have, like a little computer in our pocket where we could check the news every day. The way that most people consume the news in the late 1990s was, on the Nation page of the local newspaper or watching the evening news, both local and national, at 5 and 5:30, which is why it's important to establish that on October 7th, 1998, I did not yet know that anything had happened in Laramie, Wyoming. But on the evening of October 7th, 1998, I ran a cross-country meet for my high school in West Tennessee. And I came home and I called a friend of mine named Celia Johnson. And that was actually the first time I came out. And it took me many years to recognize that I had come out of the closet as Matthew Shepard's story was beginning to unfold in the national news. Because again, we weren't plugged into constant news cycles. I was in college before I started to realize this very meaningful coincidence, one might say, that I don't want to be misunderstood, to pretend that I came out because of Matthew Shepard, but that my coming out coincided with that event is one of the reasons why that this event being planned for tonight just struck me. And I wanted to start with that, not necessarily because there is a direct line from Matthew Shepard's attack and murder, my coming out, to Gay Faulkner, but in a way, it was the start of a process of coming out, of actually determining I wanted to study LGBTQ plus communities and identities and apply it to literature, and has very much influenced my sense of what it means to be a scholar who is also something of an activist, at least to the extent that telling LGBTQ plus stories can matter and can make a difference beyond just in an academic field as a matter of curiosity. That telling these types of stories and framing these lives can have an impact in the real world in a very real way. So as a start, that may seem like, wow, that's kind of heavy. To make it a little bit lighter, I guess, I will go into something a little more recent with the book. And it is actually something that occurred at the end of the process of writing it that speaks to why the project is, and it's has in my own mind even sort of, I recognize maybe it was more important than even I realized at the time when I was writing it. As I was completing the book, the University Press of Mississippi and I were going back and forth with page proofs and all the tiny little things they don't tell you about with books until it's time to publish one. And you're like, I gave you the book, publish it. Why am I having to do more work? You edit it. I don't want to edit it. But I was going back and forth and they finally send me an email saying, we've got the page proofs ready, but we need a couple of pieces of information from you. Do you want to write an acknowledgement? And do you want to write a dedication? I'm dedicating this, to my mom, or something like you're supposed to do for your first book. And as that was occurring, I get an email out of the blue from a high school student in Virginia whose class was reading a Faulkner story. Faulkner's story, A Rose for Emily, which is probably still the most taught short story by Faulkner at the high school level, though when you start realizing what it's about, it's curious why that would be one we choose for high school students to read. And the student was reading A Rose for Emily, and he was absolutely convinced that Homer Byron, one of the two main characters, has to be gay. He's definitely gay. How could you not know he's gay? And so he brought this up to his teacher. Can I write a paper about how Homer Byron in this story is definitely gay? And the teacher said, I don't know. I don't know if that's true. Prove it. And the student's like, well, I mean, did you read the story? Like, well, here, like, what is like, are we reading the same thing? And so he was a very, a precocious student who didn't just go home and like do a quick, Wikipedia search. He went home and he started like doing a search, Faulkner, homosexuality, gay, Rose for Emily. My book hadn't been published yet, but at that point I had enough publications out there and my name was tied to this project that was coming up on Gay Faulkner. So he finds out that there's a professor named Phillip Gordon at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville who's working on Gay Faulkner. And so he writes me an email, just out of the blue. Dr. Gordon, I'm trying to prove Homer Byron's gay for my teacher. Can you help me do that? And of course I was like, can you wait like a few months till the book comes out? Because I don't want to like tell you all the answers here. But I helped him out and just sort of gave him some ways to get started. But it struck me that question, is Homer Byron gay, is actually asked a lot. In fact, when it comes to William Faulkner, there are two stories, well, one story and one novel, that are like, they kind of represent the entirety of inquiries into homosexuality and its influence on the works of William Faulkner. One is A Rose for Emily, which Faulkner published in 1930, and the other is his famous novel, Absalom, Absalom, which is often considered like the great American novel, but does have a lot of instances of two guys whose relationships do at times feel more than platonic. And in the world of Faulkner studies, where there is no dearth of scholarship, I may tell you that, there are actually a decent number of essays beginning largely in the 1980s on A Rose for Emily that inquire as to whether or not this guy, Homer Byron, is gay. And with Absalom, we can go back to the 50s when there are references in some scholarly works that might suggest that some people could possibly see a character as a homosexual. But it's actually not until the 1990s until we see essay-length studies trying to unpack this idea. With Absalom, we still to this day have some really provocative articles, like scholars putting out their scholarly articles on, that was redundant for repetitive scholars and their scholarly articles, Absalom, exploring ways in which it could be gay. But most of those articles step back from the ledge. They're like, no, it's just sort of like queer adjacent. Or man, I don't know if you can really say that because historical contexts are challenging. And it's not that these scholars are like dumb or something. It's just they don't want to say something that has historically even at times been called the glove that dare not speak its name, right? When it comes to understanding homosexual identities throughout time, it's that silence that is always where we end. And in studies of Absalom, it can feel like that's about as far as people want to go. With A Rose for Emily, it actually starts with this seedy article in a high school pedagogy journal trying to help high school teachers know what to teach, wherein the writer in the 1980s starts writing about how A Rose for Emily could be gay, but he doesn't call it homosexuality. He calls it pederasty, which is a word that that's not a chill word to use to discuss LGBTQ identities anymore. And he sort of makes a tee-hee joke about how Romans and Greeks might have had sex like that, which leads to a response article by two high school teachers writing into this journal to say that, I mean, we can't let students think Homer Byron is gay because the representation of this gay character is so troubling and wrong and scary that it would be dangerous for our students to talk about him as gay. And again, it's not a happy story by any stretch of the imagination. But in a world in which there is so little LGBTQ representation, and in which, especially in the 90s and in the early 2000s, and even up till today, where it's difficult for students who are coming out as queer and trying to understand their queer identities to find representation. Sometimes that one bit of representation, however negative it may be, can change how those students understand their place because they see themselves finally and can start talking about what it means for them to be queer. So to even deny, we can't do this because it might upset some students. No, we need to have these conversations. So in both of these sustained conversations, there is a reluctance to speak openly. Even in 2018, as I was preparing the final manuscript for publication, there was yet another one of these articles in a journal devoted to how to teach these stories at a high school level, working very hard to say, don't say Homer Byron's gay. Well, why not? What if we do say he's gay? Why is it that we're afraid of approaching these questions and just, I don't know, throwing out the possibility that it's a way we could read? And that previous slide I mentioned, this is a question that is asked all the time. At the annual Faulkner Conference in Mississippi, there is a morning devoted to teaching Faulkner, during which any attendees, often of whom are high school teachers, can write questions that a panel of Faulkner scholars will address. Almost every year, someone writes, my students want to know if Homer Byron is gay. Is he? Famously, one of the old guard Faulkner scholars, who's now in his 80s, one time they asked the question, he stood up, walked to the mic, and he said, no, and turned around and sat back down. And that was the end of the conversation. And there needs to be more conversation than that. But as someone who was looking for more conversation, what ended up happening was someone would say, okay, well, then write another essay about A Rose for Emily or Absalom, or maybe consider this one character. But how could you write a book? How could you do a whole study? There's just not enough, because Faulkner, everybody knows, this apex writer in the American canon, couldn't possibly be gay, couldn't possibly be part of gay communities, couldn't possibly be comfortable around gay men, because that's the margins. That's that other genre of literature. And I just didn't feel like that was right. In terms of A Rose for Emily, though, for what it's worth, when I say it's a bit of an awkward story, it is set in a town called Jefferson, which is Faulkner's famous fictional town at the heart of and I even mess up Yoknapatawpha, Yoknapatawpha. Yeah, it's one of those you have to practice saying over and over again. I live in Wisconsin now. It took me a while to say words like Economawalk, but I got Yoknapatawpha eventually. Jefferson, Mississippi. It centers around Emily Grierson and Homer Byron. Emily Grierson is a local woman whose father was very demanding and wouldn't let her date, wouldn't let her get out of the house much. So when the father dies, Emily Grierson finds herself nearing an age at which she would be considered a spinster, which is also in the order of this town not acceptable, but having no experience with men and never having had the opportunity to be courted. And along comes Homer Byron, a Yankee, a man from up north, who comes to town. And the town doesn't like the idea of a good Southern girl marrying a Yankee, but they like that idea more than Emily Grierson being a spinster or an old maid in the very gendered order of antebellum South, the postbellum South of the 1870s to 1890s when the story is set. So Emily and Homer, the town become convinced, start dating, start courting. But the town's a little bit suspicious. They're like, does Emily know that he's not the type of man for her? And there are two specific lines in the story that people point to. That's what piques the interest of wondering if Homer Byron is gay. Is this what's going on? Is this where the tension in the story emerges? That Emily picks this last available bachelor who is a certified bachelor, or as the story describes him, not the marrying kind, which is a euphemism from that time period to describe men who were known as homosexual before a word like homosexual became a word that you would hear spoken aloud by people in communities. There's even a quote in the story where the narrator says he liked men. And there's many ways to take that, but it is easy to perhaps consider that it's a suggestion that, he liked men in a liking kind of way. And that he is an eligible bachelor, but doesn't seem determined to marry Emily. Begs the question as to why. And it's for these reasons that people wonder if he could be gay. And it is a ubiquitous question amongst readers of this story that keeps getting shot down and shot down. Now, for the record, what happens in the story is that Homer Byron disappears from town one day. The narrator of the story is like, well, we figured he'd probably run off after a while anyway. Nothing to worry about. 30 years go by. Emily becomes the old maid that everyone thought she was going to be, sort of a burden on the town that everyone feels like they have to take care of. Then she dies, and the whole town is so interested in what happened to Emily and her house that she had basically been a shut-in inside of for all these years. So after the funeral, they go to her house. Her African-American servant opens the door, walks right out the back and disappears. Little hint that something is amiss. The town people go upstairs. They pry open the bedroom door. And there on the bed is the 30-year-old decayed corpse of Homer Byron, whom she poisoned and had been sleeping beside for the intervening 30 years. So it is, okay, it's a story about necrophilia, but it's Faulkner and it's the South. So you just sort of get over those types of Gothic tropes after a while. But again, beyond the necrophilia, the reason why Emily kills him is because he is spurning those advances. What's causing that? That's one of the stories that piques people's interest. But when they ask, what ends up happening is actually related to something that has been explored by queer theorists. A woman named Eve Sedgwick, in a famous book called Epistemology of the Closet, looks at the ways in which even the very idea that a character could be gay is shot down. She asks questions. Is there a gay Proust? Is there a gay Shakespeare? And then she says, yeah, and their names are Proust and Shakespeare. But when people ask questions about any main author or about characters in main canonical works, asking if they could be queer in some way, a whole series of well, but you can't say that because in that time period, homosexuality wasn't understood the same way as us. Or you can't say that because at the time it was more common for men to show affection between each other, and therefore we can't interpret in this certain way. And she just goes through everything, but then she said, I can sum it up one way in one little phrase. If you ask the question, is this person gay? The answer is almost always, don't ask, or you shouldn't know. That's Eve Sedgwick's version of this. Actually, it flows from a feminist theorist named Adrienne Rich, who wrote an essay on what she calls compulsory heterosexuality, which she diagnosed as one of the reasons why there have to be coming out narratives at all, that in our society, we assume everyone is straight and then treat everyone as straight, thus denying people who are queer visibility until they literally tell you, look here, look at me, I'm a queer person. We don't come out as straight. We don't come out as cisgender, for those of you familiar with that term. But you have to come out as the other because of compulsory heterosexuality. And to add a little bit of levity and some humor at this moment, like when I try to explain compulsory heterosexuality to my students, they often get confused about compulsory versus compulsive. Like a compulsive liar can't stop lying. A compulsive heterosexual would be someone who cannot help. They literally like, I am heterosexual. Oh, I'm feeling so heterosexual. I'm so heterosexual right now. That's not what we're talking about. Compulsory is that society has created structure that from the moment you are born and assigned a gender, there are certain tracks that it is assumed that your life will flow in. And if you are in any way not flowing in those two tracks, you have to go seek the knowledge for yourself to figure out what is the issue. Well, that's what's going on with Faulkner. We assume that there's only one way to understand Faulkner, that he was born in 1897, that his widow would eventually explain by age 6 years old, she and Billy knew they were made for each other and were star-crossed lovers, that they were going to get married, and eventually they get married, and he had a child with her, and then he died in 1962, and everything is a straight and narrow path of the great white male author, who therefore is also a heterosexual cisgender, and to ask other questions outside of that, or ask if his fiction might explore something more complicated, becomes the don't ask, you should know, everyone knows. It's all about the heterosexuality. Why are you bringing this other stuff up? And I just didn't feel like that was the right approach to take to Faulkner. But as I tried to understand Faulkner, my original question was Faulkner gay? Which would be an inquiry that the answer to that question would be a matter of finding, I don't know, a really salacious letter that Faulkner wrote to a guy, and detailing in many different adjectives all the ways in which he wants to do various things we associate with copulation. You know, nope, that letter doesn't exist. Or finding like pictures of Faulkner like half naked with another man in a compromising position that could not be written off as, well, men were just more affectionate. Like, no, that is not the type of affection we need. But if the question of the project was, is Faulkner gay? Is Faulkner homosexual? And I was trying to out him in that way, then there's a certain way in which I could try to prove that, but you always run up against the realities that he was married to a woman. He did have actually multiple extramarital affairs with women, that he, in his life, did have a great deal of anxiety about gender and sexuality that shows up in his works. And even if I did literally find a picture of him having sex with a man, does that mean he was a homosexual, or does that mean he just had sex with a man one time, but was actually committed to women and it's a one-off kind of deal? That's not what I want to explore in a work like Gay Faulkner. Instead, the idea of Gay Faulkner is to take an epistemological approach and how we know homosexuality when we see it, and what we can know about queer identities as they appear, especially in text, and how those texts are related to the lives of the authors who produced them. And the introduction of it said, the goal of the study is not to prove or disprove Faulkner's sexuality. I am not terribly interested in that. It is to prove that Faulkner was very aware of same-sex desire, that Faulkner knew gay men throughout his life, that actually when you start digging around and look beyond the traditional narrative of Faulkner's life, he actually seemed to prefer the company of gay men, whether he himself was gay or not. And when I say prefer the company of, I mean like chose to be roommates with openly gay and openly sexually active gay men. His longest and most endearing lifelong friendship was with a gay man he met in college, who is literally, of all of Faulkner's male friends, the only one who he doesn't alienate at some point in his life and sticks with him to the very end, and also is the only non-blood relation who is allowed to sit in the family's pew at his own daughter's wedding. That surely, that doesn't mean that Faulkner and this guy were having sex, but that does mean that it's difficult to imagine that Faulkner was that close with another man who was openly gay and like was not aware of it, or was somehow deeply anxious over what homosexuality meant. That Faulkner as a young child, because he was into arts and writing and literature, he actually, it was a well-known story around town that people in his hometown of Oxford, Mississippi, as a young man, they called him, and every biographer actually spells it Quair. They called him Quair. the colloquial, the local version of queer, a word that at that moment in time was actually acquiring its homosexual connotations. In college, when he met this friend of his named Ben Wasson, he and Ben Wasson would go out to the Grove at Ole Miss's campus, and they'd sit out on a verdant lawn there. And Ben Wasson, who is described as having this angelic beauty, and he was actually 16 years old, and the word twink comes to mind, and I'll just sort of stop right there, but all of you look that up on Wikipedia or something if you need to know. Was a bit of a twink. So here's Ben Wasson like lavishly laying out on the grass while William Faulkner stands there and reads Conrad Aiken poetry about like drag queens to him. And some co-eds on campus are walking by and they're like, they're queer. And that's a story that's reported for William Faulkner. So he knew that people perceived him as a homosexual, whether he was or not. And he didn't reject that. In fact, throughout his life, he would perform publicly in ways that seems to have wanted to provoke people to think he might be a homosexual. Whether he was or not, it's not the question to be asking here. It's that he does seem to understand that gay desire, queer desire, same-sex desire is important. It has radical power to challenge some kind of sense of institutional structures. And that he really seemed to be very deeply committed to queer friendships and found himself in queer communities. And yet, so much of that has been erased from what we know about his life. And on that note, moving into part 2 to help understand a bit about what the book is doing to try to reclaim a version of Faulkner that is not quite so compulsory heterosexual. What I ended up starting with was trying to answer the question about Gay Faulkner through an epistemological lens. And for those of you who are part of the Academy, digging deep into the history of sexuality by Michel Foucault and reading other queer theorists and trying to see if there was a way I could articulate queer identity across time that would feel like it was both responsible to nuance and history and historicity and historiography and all those words. But actually, finally, one of my committee members, Dr. Jamie Harker at the University of Mississippi said, you ever thought about just going to an archive and seeing what you find? Yeah, wow, that's cool. Why don't I try that? And so I start looking around and I'm looking for an archive. And the archive I decided to go to is actually the archive of William Faulkner's authorized biographer, Joseph Blattner. So Faulkner met Blattner in the 1950s when Faulkner was at the University of Virginia, where his daughter was going to school, doing kind of a writer in residence there. When Faulkner died, Blattner reached out to Faulkner's widow, Estelle, and said, can I maybe be the biographer? I really want to write this. And I have had the pleasure of holding in my hand a little handwritten note from Estelle to Joseph Blattner. Please be advised, Joseph Blattner is the authorized biography of my late husband, William Faulkner, Estelle Oldham Faulkner. And so he can show that around and get all the goods and information when Blattner starts asking all the questions about Faulkner's military career, which he never had, by the way. He had lied about it so extensively in his life that people thought he fought in the war, but he never did. And find out about from his agents and his friends and the people he hung out with when he lived in New Orleans in the 1920s and his life in New York. So Blattner takes this and he starts collecting data. And that data ends up becoming what's now actually 3 distinct sources of information on William Faulkner's life. So Blattner begins that process in the mid-1960s, interviewing people, writing letters, seeking out publicly available data from census records on family history, contacting every single branch of both US and British armed services, trying to find records about what Faulkner's real extent of serving in World War I might have been, anything he can access. Blattner begins collecting it. And after about 10 years, he publishes a 2-volume, nearly 2,000-page biography of Faulkner that is a monumental work of scholarship. It also reads a lot like an encyclopedia. It is the most boring Wikipedia entry ever written. It's again, I'm not trying to diss on Blattner's amazing scholarship, but Blattner recognized that he was producing something that was just like this massive timeline of data. And as soon as he published it in 1974, he immediately began to get even more information. People who had known Faulkner and had been reluctant to speak felt the need to correct some of the information that had appeared in the 1974 version. Also, Faulkner's widow, Estelle, lived until 1972. And there were people who emerged in 75, 76, and 77 who had purposely not responded to Blattner's inquiries because they were going to bring up information that they knew would harm Estelle, such as Faulkner's extensive relationships, extramarital affairs with women, or Faulkner's very, very significant alcoholism that the family was trying to suppress, and other things that biographers want to know, but that sometimes families don't. So Faulkner realizes he's going to have to write a revised volume, and he spends about 10 years collecting new information. But when he writes the revised volume in 1984, he adds new information. He corrects errors from the original 2,000-page encyclopedia. He also makes it into more of a readable narrative of a life that we more associate with the biography you pull off the shelf at Books A Million. And although the second volume is about 600 pages long, it is a very readable biography, and it's the standard biography of William Faulkner. You want to know something about Faulkner? You just thumb through that index, use what Faulkner created, because he found so much. But actually, Faulkner found even more than all of that, and he collected it, literally in egg crates that he would keep in his garage until an archivist got a donor to help purchase them and get them into a library. And that larger archive is the original copies of all the letters, all of Faulkner's interview notes, which includes both his shorthand notes that he took while he was doing the interviews, that he would immediately go home and type into semi-legible English as interview notes that would then become more advanced, well-written stuff that he would pull into the biography. That includes every single thing he got in the mail relevant to Faulkner when he would ask for information. That includes every article he found in a newspaper. He made a copy of it and threw it into an archive or a folder in case he needed it. And it's a magnificent archive of knowledge, but it's also enormous and huge. And I decided, sure, I'll go there and I'll see if I can find a needle in a haystack that might help me understand to what extent did Faulkner know anything about Faulkner's relationships with gay men and intimacies with gay lives and submergences in the gay communities. And so there's sort of three avenues that I want to turn to. And I'll say up front for anybody listening in online or here that what I'm going to go through as some examples of the types of material I found is not by itself enough to prove or disprove anything. But in the interest of time, I can't go through all of my data. I'm trying to show you some of the types of materials that I found that help me understand where we need to go to reconstruct Faulkner's life a little more fully. And so three ways of trying to look at Faulkner and construct Gay Faulkner through the archives. Three ways of doing that might start with kind of the most common narrative when it comes to queer lives. Someone leads a queer life, and over time, through their biographies and interviews, that queerness is erased. Or someone has connections to queer communities that are sort of intentionally suppressed. And unfortunately, in Faulkner's archive, there's proof of that. I really respect Faulkner's work as a biographer. He was an excellent scholar, and I don't want to just badmouth him. He's been dead for many years now, but as a Faulknerian, I have a lot of respect for his work. But he was guilty of, at times, knowing things that he seems to have very intentionally cut, such as when he interviewed a woman named Monique Lang. Monique Lang knew Faulkner in the 50s. Monique Lang one night was hanging out with Faulkner and Tennessee Williams, and they went to a party with a group of friends. In the original interview notes, Monique Lang explains very clearly, Gene set up a big dinner at one of the best Paris restaurants. Tennessee Williams and his Italian boyfriend were there, is what Monique Lang told Faulkner. That's the interview notes that Faulkner types up from his shorthand from the interview itself. When he transfers these interview notes into the 2-volume edition in 1974, this is what appears instead. The other guests included Tennessee Williams and a young friend of his from Italy. Well, Tennessee Williams is very well known as a gay author. So if one knows about Tennessee Williams, one can infer that the young friend from Italy might be a lover. But that relationship is erased into another guy at the party who knew Tennessee, as opposed to his Italian boyfriend. Instances like this occur across interview notes to 74 edition to the 1984 edition as time goes on. The reason there's nothing highlighted on the screen right now is because there is now no reference to Tennessee Williams having anyone with him at the party at all. It is instead Monique Lang, Gene Stein organized, at which Tennessee Williams seemed worshipful. Tennessee Williams was apparently just like having a stag night out with some buddies, but no one there was with him except, Monique and Faulkner. What does emerge in all three versions of this, from the original interview notes to 74 to 84, is that part at the end, though. Back a bit. At the original party, William Faulkner is hanging out with Tennessee Williams and his Italian boyfriend and Monique Lang. And they're having a great night, and they go to a party, and after a while, Tennessee Williams gets bored and he wants to go to another party. And so Monique Lang says, "Hey, Billy, I'd like to go to this party with Tennessee." To which William Faulkner does respond. He laughed and said, "Go with your queers." When you start removing the queer people from the story, suddenly, go with your queers? Who do you mean? And even in this version, all we know is Tennessee Williams is there. The go with your queers, in my mind, becomes a pejorative. Instead of being a go with your queers, I know you gay folks go have a fun night at your party, I don't want to go to the next house, becomes out of nowhere, Faulkner like, you want to go with them? But we don't even know who they are. So what's kept is the notion that Faulkner had some pejorative against gay identities. What's erased are the gay people who are at the party who are part of Faulkner's like posse that night. And that's awkward. And that happens in a few key places where it's clear that Faulkner knew that Faulkner had these relationships with gay men, hung out with them, interacted with them socially, was comfortable around them, becomes anxiety models in which the gay people are erased. Faulkner knew more than that too. There's evidence in his archives and in his Faulkner papers that he actually had people bring up to him information about homosexuality. And the way he responded was fascinating, very fast. So in 1980, a man named Paul Rogers had read Faulkner's 2-volume 1974 biography. And he had some issues with parts of it. So he writes Faulkner a letter, just saying, "I love what you had to write, but I was actually an undergraduate with William Faulkner when he was at the University of Mississippi in the late 19-teens to 1920. And I want to give you a better sense of what campus life was like at that time." And without prompting, for no reason at all, Paul Rogers goes out of his way to explain this in one of the letters. "The University of Mississippi is the one place where I had lived as an adult that homosexuality was a theme of no interest to the students. In fact, I never heard the word during the 4 years I was there. There was another, but so seldom heard that it is fair to say that the matter was almost never discussed. I wish it were that way now." And it's that last line that gives something away here. I wish it were that way. Now they're everywhere, those gays. But when I was at the University of Mississippi, we were good old red-blooded American men. Yeah, we didn't talk about that. But this is completely unprompted. Like what got him to even want to write this to begin with? Faulkner wasn't seeking information on Faulkner's ties to gay men. The original 2-volume edition is not overwhelmed with evidence of Faulkner knowing gay men or being involved in gay communities and comfortable around people with gay identities. Where is this coming from? To his credit, Faulkner responds by saying, "Are you sure?" I'm paraphrasing, admittedly, that's not the exact quote, but that's the tone. "Are you sure? Because, in the 1920s, William Faulkner began his poetic career by publishing poems in the University of Mississippi student newspaper. One of them is literally called Sapphics, a reference to Sappho. Another literally has a line, the lesbians, in it. They're lesbian-themed poetry, which, by the way, Faulkner was not really generous with lesbian identities. I'll just say that. He certainly exhibits some misogyny towards lesbians, as if it's cool to be a gay man, but lesbians they need to sort of get their act together because women aren't supposed to be for men or something like that. Something perhaps we can talk about in the Q&A if anyone's interested. But he certainly was aware of homosexuality and is being published in the student newspaper. So surely people on campus might have read it and it was discussed. But then, of course, in this, in fact, I never heard that word. There was another, but so seldom heard it. It was almost never mentioned. It's like he's tap dancing around the fact that there was an open secret on the campus that people knew about. So when Faulkner responds, it actually leads to Paul Rogers really going off the deep end, basically saying, "No, that wasn't there. That's not a thing. listen to me, there was nothing gay about the University of Mississippi campus in the 20s. Please don't ever say there was. He actually ends up writing this in a letter back. So he writes to Faulkner, Faulkner responds, pushes back and says, I have evidence that there was at least some knowledge of queer identities. To which Rogers responds, but one thing is certain, the subject of homosexuality was not at that time of much concern, as it is now and has been for these last 50 years. In fact, at the university, there was only one word for it, indicated by the two letters C and S. And I have no idea who's live streaming, so I'm not going to say what I think those letters stand for, but I think many of you can probably deduce it if you try. And a male student's pun donor, or point of honor, was phrased as follows: if one ever approaches you, stop him. So let me get this right. This is a university where no one talked about homosexuality or knew about homosexuality, except sometimes, except that everyone was already trading pejoratives to identify people on campus they thought were gay, and making sure all the guys on campus knew how to act if a gay man approaches you, I guess presumably for sex or something. Except that William Faulkner was the one hanging out with one of the guys on campus everyone knew was homosexual, that people were literally calling Faulkner queer on the university campus. And basically Rogers is, when you start reading through what he's saying, he's desperate to make it seem like the University of Mississippi is this safe, rural space, and that homosexuality thing only exists in big cities or in France or something like that. In reality, homosexuality is ubiquitous in Western societies. It crops up in rural environments. People in rural environments are not like just clods who have never heard of these types of things. They're well versed with terminology and with difference. And homosexuality is not unnative to the South or to any other space, rural or otherwise. But here's Paul Rogers, desperate for Faulkner to pretend that it is, rather than be honest about the fact that it's not that way at all. Or this, one other way of looking. So at first we start with the ways in which queer identities are disappeared from the actual revisions of the text itself. Then there are ways in which we find evidence that never make it into the biographies that Faulkner was aware of queerness in Faulkner's early life, and by the way, throughout his life as well, but for some reason chooses not to feature that in many of the stories that he's telling about Faulkner's life. But when we start looking at those, what emerges is, again, not an image of William Faulkner as like going out to gay bars and having a great time dancing on the bar top with, like, I don't know, some like his twin boyfriend, Ben Wasson, or something like that. Ben Wasson was not his boyfriend, but was a twin. And I don't use that word in any kind of negative way. Like I was a twink at one point too. It happens to all of us. But that when you start saying, wait, if there was known queerness, queer community, queer peoples, and Faulkner was not unsettled by them, where does that strand lead? Well, it starts to lead us into recognizing that when he inhabits places like New York City, where in the early 20s, mid-20s, and through the 30s, he finds himself very comfortable. He often wants to get to New York to get away from Mississippi. And when he goes to New York, at first he wants to stay with his buddy from Oxford, Stark Young, a gay writer from Oxford, Mississippi, who lived alone in Greenwich Village, which even in the 1890s was a well-known gay neighborhood in New York City, like Midtown, basically in Memphis, or Cooper Young, right? So we have Faulkner seeking out gay communities in New York. In the 1930s and into the 1940s, when he's in New York, he joins a group of Southern writers, many of whom he met when he was in New Orleans in the 20s. They actually have a name for themselves, the Southern Protective Association, bunch of admittedly white male Southern writers who are all hanging out, drinking slow drip coffee in New York City and talking about how much they love being back home. Literally, they're not back home, they're in New York. And almost every single writer associated with this circle has been identified as a gay writer at some point. And Faulkner's part of that circle. And again, not suggesting that means Faulkner was also gay. Oh, here's the smoking gun. But he's clearly comfortable reading gay writers, talking to gay writers, engaged in queer community spaces without anxiety. And a lot of this stems from in the 1920s when he was in New Orleans. He roomed with an openly gay man named William Spratling. When they traveled to Europe together, one of the most important things Faulkner did, insisted upon, was going to Oscar Wilde's tomb. When he wrote home to his mother and to his friend Ben Wasson from his trips to Europe with Spratling, he actually told Spratling stories as they happened to him, including the night that William Spratling was arrested because he got really drunk in the bar and things happened. And William Spratling was arrested, went to jail. When William Faulkner went to get Spratling out the next morning, Spratling confesses to William that, so by the way, last night I kind of had sex with another guy in the jail cell. William Faulkner appropriates that story, puts himself in the jail cell, and writes back to Ben Wasson in Mississippi to say that he was the one who was arrested. And again, it's all like him taking identities and playing with these identities. At what point does the performance of an identity become so saturated in a sense of self that it is the reality for the self? That's a really fancy way of going through Judith Butler's notions as a I cannot recall, not gender trouble, the short arm, she wrote gender insubordination. Do you remember anybody? No, okay. Imitation and gender insubordination. I knew I would get there if I kept working over my head, where she starts to articulate what is now well established in queer theory circles about performative identities. And we are all performing identities. They just feel real to us. At what point does Faulkner's performance as a gay man become the reality we want to understand for Faulkner? And why are we denying the possibility that it could exist? And then, of course, I can talk about Faulkner's oldest friend, Ben Wasson, who, by the way, in the early 1980s, just before his own death, wrote down his draft for what had been published as his memoir, Count No Count, Flashbacks to Faulkner, where he recounts when he met Faulkner and the beginnings of their relationship at Ole Miss. And he is not one to kiss and tell. But if you read the memoir through the lens of a closeted memoir by a gay man from the 1920s who's not yet ready to be public about it in writing, again, he never confessed that he and Faulkner had sex, but he's actually narrating a long love letter to someone who was clearly deeply emotionally important in his life. And he and Faulkner had many intimate moments together, walking alone through woods near campus at night, running off together to listen to music and share ideas about art that Faulkner felt he couldn't share with others on campus. And what Wasson is establishing for us is an alternative narrative to the narrative of Faulkner's wife, who, by the way, was not around in the 1920s because she married another man and had 2 of his children. So I guess that whole we're fated to be together thing is maybe a revision for later in life. And we can actually see moments in Wasson's memoir where we have events that might have been what Faulkner used when he writes some of his own novels. If Faulkner remembers walking next to Ben Wasson in the woods one night, one of his first published poems in a major magazine called Portrait is actually a gender ambiguous poem about a taller person walking next to a smaller person that becomes an intimate moment between lovers. But there is no gender to it. Well, what if it's the slightly smaller Wasson and the slightly taller Faulkner instead of Faulkner and a woman? Just ways to think differently about how we interpret his text that are not necessarily by themselves right, but that just give us a different way of seeing. Or one that was in the running a long time, I'm not going to go into great detail. I also connect Faulkner in the 40s and 50s in particular to a lot of other queer writers. Down south of Oxford, Mississippi, a little town called Water Valley. A writer named Hubert Creekmore comes out of Water Valley in the 1920s, also as an undergraduate at the University of Mississippi, becomes friends with some of Faulkner's gay friends like Ben Wasson. Creekmore begins his own writing career in the late 1920s and the 1930s. And he actually befriends William Faulkner, who writes for Creekmore an introduction letter to his editors and publishers in New York. So Creekmore can go conquer the world. Creekmore is not a terribly well-known writer these days. He did in the 40s finally get around to publishing a few novels, including one titled The Welcome, which is in 1948, a revolutionary novel because it is an open novel about gay men and gay marriage from 1948 set in the small town of Ashton, which is modeled after Water Valley. It was reviewed in the New York Times 2 pages after the review of Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust, and there's actually deep connections between the Creekmore family. And I have a hard time believing Faulkner was unaware of Creekmore's novel, The Welcome. And in my book, I argue that in 1948, he might have read it and it influenced some of his writings, Faulkner's own writings in the 1950s, when he starts using queer representation to tackle McCarthyism in the House Un-American Activities Committee, and how the Red Scare and Lavender Scares coexisted side by side. And Faulkner, a radical to the end, pushed back by actually creating Cold War homosexuality as a radical and powerful representation, not as something to be afraid of. And as you start making the bigger connections, you start being able to revise the literature, which admittedly I'm not doing here. This talk has mostly been trying to set up the idea of what Gay Faulkner is and go through some of the archival material. And this isn't the plug of now, if you want to know more, you should buy my book. But by the way, you can, it's for sale over there, and also online, but if we have a different narrative of Faulkner's life, can we then take that narrative of Faulkner's life and reassess what we do, not with one story, but with all of it? So is Homer Byron gay? I don't know if he's gay or not, but I do know that Faulkner structures in these little tiny clues that we can read as a possibility, and we don't have to foreclose because don't say that. Let's not talk about that. That's not kosher. You don't need to know. And as I get ready to conclude here, I will say, some of you might recognize that phrase at the top. I'm in the state of Tennessee, where I grew up at a time when we certainly did not talk about whether or not the writers we were reading in high school were gay, straight, or anything else. We just assumed they were. Then we would read a Walt Whitman poem, and somebody in the class would be like, wasn't he one of them homosexuals? Or something, and the teacher's like, but actually, this is one of many states that has, at several different times in the past few years, had legislatures propose a Don't Say Gay bill, which is basically a ban on even talking about homosexuality in the classroom, at least from the middle school level and down. Sometimes there's a sense it should be pushed upward in the high school level. And I don't think they necessarily try to target universities, but certainly there are attempts, as you were mentioning earlier, when we think about like critical race theory. The conversations about trying to silence critical race theory are actually very similar to ways in which there have been legislative acts to try to silence discussions of queer identities and gender nonconformity. But what if we revise all that by saying that the apex author in the center of the American canon is himself relevant to understanding gay history, and therefore we can do the same methodologies, the same epistemologies to re-see broadly, not just like the great white writer here, but really almost anyone else. And they may not all be connected to queer communities in the same way, but we have to do more than simply say, don't ask, you shouldn't know, and try to make that conversation just silence. And it's on that note that I will conclude today with where I started, sort of, not the Matthew Shepard thing, about that student who emailed me. That student emailed me and asked me that question about Homer Byron and all the innocence in the world. And I actually do know who the student is. I'm Facebook friends with him now. It seems like a pretty cool kid. I don't know if he identifies as queer or not. But at the time, it struck me that the work I was doing might actually matter more than just an academic curiosity. And so I decided not to dedicate my book to Mom, though my mom may be watching live tonight and will watch the video of this. To you, Mom, thanks. It was great. I always appreciate the support. Yeah, Instead, I decided to take a line from William Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying, which he wrote at the exact midpoint of his career. In that novel, there is a character named Darrell Bundren, one of 5 children of the Bundren family. When the Bundren family's mother, Addie, dies, the family decides to tote her body across the hot, miserable August Mississippi countryside. It takes 9 days to get to Jefferson to bury her. It is Southern Gothic grotesquerie at its like the height. But throughout all of it, Darrell Bundren is the one person in the family who opposes what's going on. He ends up being the one the family sacrifices and literally like kicks out and has him sent to a mental institution in Jackson, Mississippi. And the word queer appears 6 times in that novel. 5 of those times it is used to describe Darrell. One of those times someone calls him queer and says the solution is he just needs a wife to get his mind off things. You can read Darrell Bundren as a possibly queer character, and when you do, at the end of the novel, when his brother Cash is narrating his fate of being rejected from the family and locked away, suddenly the line that Cash uses to describe Darrell takes on different resonance. Cash says of Darrell, this world is not his world, this life his life. And so in the dedication, I thought, I don't need to dedicate this to my parents, I'll dedicate it to the queer kids. So they know this is their world too. So I always get really pushed all that. It just means a lot to me. So on that note, I appreciate very much your time tonight. And it is always a pleasure to get to talk about a book that I wrote. Thank you. I'm gonna drink water. I swear, I go a million miles an hour all the time, and then I just like crash. So,
so I'm just going to start with a question or two, and then I can open it up if anyone would like to ask a question too. And I think we have somebody who's going to man the chat. Okay. First, thank you so much. That was, as someone who's read a lot of Faulkner, one of those academic PhDs you were talking about, I think that you opened up something that I had never seen in Faulkner before. And I'm really, and I really, really enjoyed reading your book too. And both in reading the book and in hearing your talk, what I've realized is that title, Gay Faulkner, is just as much about what we don't know about the adjective gay during Faulkner's lifetime as what we don't know about queerness or gay identity in Faulkner's own life. And what you get to is the usefulness of a gay identity for Faulkner at given moments in his life, for his writerly career, for his social standing at the University of Mississippi. And I guess one question I wanted to ask is this something that you see is unique to Faulkner in this adoption or this latching onto or attaching himself to queer communities or a gay identity as a sort of professional move might be too strong of a statement, but is this something that other writers or other artists are doing in the South or in the 20s when Faulkner is sort of trying on these performances?
when we think about, especially like the modernist writers who the generation that Faulkner was most aligned with, amongst them, there's a lot of, I don't know, posturing. Hemingway postures as this hyper-masculine figure. Faulkner famously at one point publicly said that Hemingway had no courage and led to this sort of snafu between the two of them because it was a slide on his masculinity, which he was very much overperforming. And writers and artists in general can have that performative side of themselves. Oscar Wilde is, of course, very famous for it, though Oscar Wilde was also much easier to align with queer communities. No one really argues with you on that. But Faulkner, amongst writers of his era, may have gone the farthest generally to performative identities in different settings. And as you sort of say, for like professional purposes, to be clear about the World War I story, he wanted to fight in World War I. He was convinced that being this like brave aviator, like, you know, the Bloody Red Baron or something was going to be the coolest thing ever. And he was determined to do it. He couldn't get into the US Army. So he actually fakes a British accent from his Mississippi drawl, lies about his name. It's no longer Faulkner. It's when he adds the U to make it seem more British. He says, I'm not from Oxford, Mississippi. I'm from Finchley, England. And he joins the RFC, which was at the time literally becoming the RAF. So like it's sometimes like when he joined his RFC, by the time he is decommissioned from the Army, from the Air Force, it's the RAF. But he never fights. He goes to Toronto, Canada to enroll in flight training. Literally like a month after he arrives, the 1918 influenza outbreak occurs. He ends up being quarantined on base, and the evidence suggests he never logged a single flight hour. Nonetheless, when he prepared to come home, he wrote home to his parents that he had gotten his wings and that he was a rank that he hadn't earned, and he basically bought a corporal's uniform instead of his lowly private dungarees or something. Gets off the train with a limp that's a fake limp, and over the course of the next few months begins to even say that he had been in a plane crash behind the lines in France that not only had given him the limp but also meant he had a metal plate in his head. In the 1940s, he perfected this performance so much that in the 1940s, when a man named Malcolm Cowley began to work on a book collecting Faulkner's work called The Portable Faulkner, Cowley was utterly convinced that Faulkner had actually been this war hero. And when he interviewed people who knew Faulkner, they were utterly convinced. And finally, when he's writing a biography about Faulkner's war exploits, and Faulkner realizes that he's only going to publish this so it can be disproven, basically, they get into a really nasty argument back and forth. And Faulkner's like, you will not write this if it's in page proofs. I will pay to have the proofs redone. please do not mention my military service. It's a very common thing. Well, he didn't have military service. When he went to France, went to Europe, he spent most of his time in Europe in 1925 in Paris, in France, and there's photographs of him. He grows his beard out and he starts to dress differently and begins to try to look like a bohemian poet in France. But as soon as he makes it back to the United States, he's become like, the regular Faulkner again. But a man named James Watson has written extensively about the extent to which Faulkner was always this poser. And that is where, when I think about the extent to which he will perform this identity, it feels like sort of a natural progression. But of course, the catch is he wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a bohemian poet. So what do we do with the queer identity? But it was also one he held to his whole life. And he was someone who had the ability to make that illusion real. And to an extent, I would say, and maybe someone who studies modernism is listening in and be like, that's not true. I think amongst the American modernists in particular, it was something that made him stand out even amongst them. It was just a deep part of his personality. And I think queer theorists would say, especially as we move into the mid 2010s and 20aughts, there's quite a bit of scholarship that does talk about the extent to which to be a queer person is to understand the different fronts that you wear. And the coming out process is often a matter of once you come out to yourself and maybe come out to a few friends, also still knowing how to perform identities and recognizing the performativity of identities because you're having that friction between the compulsory heterosexuality or cisgender identity that people ascribe to you and your real self. And so I think that there is something queer about performative identity generally that Faulkner's actions certainly implicates.
I'd like to ask one more question before we open it up, and that has to do with the other giant elephant in all of Faulkner's writing, which is race. And in what I found sort of fascinating in reading your book is that many of the times when Faulkner reacts against another writer, and for example, the Tennessee Williams quotation that you shared, what causes Faulkner at first to clam up is that Tennessee Williams asks him about what's going on with Southern African Americans.
Yes.
And it happens with, he turns on Carl Van Vechten, and he finds out that Carl Van Vechten has a black boyfriend.
And it's very specifically that the blackness of that boyfriend does, in the story, it's narrator, I can go into it, but maybe in a bit, is definitely part of that. So,
yeah. So I guess my question is just, do you see a connection? And then it made me think about the Joe Christmas and Honey August. Is this both racially and sexually sort of ambiguous character? Do you see a connection between Faulkner's representations of race and Faulkner's ideas about race with his representations and performances of gender and his ideas about queerness?
So in the book, there is a kind of a glaring hole in what I cover, in that I write a great deal about Faulkner's writings beginning in the 19-teens up to As I Lay Dying, which was published in 1930. There was another book that he actually had written before, but there were some issues with it, the Sex Sanctuary. So there's sort of a little gray area there. And then I jump from 1930 to the 40s, and I don't write about what has been literally called by scholars the matchless time of Faulkner when he writes his great novels like August, Go Down Moses, begins the Stokes trilogy, writes The Wild Palms, which has a lot of issue with sexuality, if not queer sexuality, certainly challenges the heterosexual norms. I ended up not writing about that period of Faulkner's life for one reason, because that period has been so studied. And I just wanted to be able to focus on some things that are less central to this well-established canonical figure, but also because I generally read Faulkner's queerness as kind of going through three phases. That as a young person, he's called queer and treated as the queer. That has sexual connotations for him in his hometown. And then when Estelle Oldham marries somebody else, it's like he embraces that queer identity in this very open way and finds himself very interested in submerging in queer communities and being around queer men. There's even some implication that people in New Orleans thought he and his roommate were lovers. They would make jokes about it. But as the late 20s approaches and he does come back to Oxford and Estelle divorces her first husband and their relationship does become a reality, there seems to be like a psychic need for him to remove that queer identity from himself. And then there's this blank period, like period 2 that I'll talk about in a second. And then towards the latter part of his life, in the 40s, it's like he reconnects with the radicalness of queer identity, especially in Cold War context. But in that period, in the 1930s to early 1940s, is also when he's writing a lot about race in these provocative ways. And I do actually think that as he approached heterosexuality as a central identity for his life and began to think of what it would mean to perform that, heterosexuality in the South at that moment, and nationwide too, but in the South, was so deeply tied to race as well. This is what Joel Williamson writes about in The Crucible of Race, which is also abridged as A Rage for Order, and many other Southern scholars have written about. That is why the nadir of the African American experience from the latter 19th century to the 1930s or 40s is this period where lynching is so incredibly common and often placed with some generic sense of fear of sexuality, and we're sexualizing Black bodies so much. And with Joe Christmas, I, at this point, don't want to write about Joe Christmas as gay, only because like there's just so much to unpack there. But there are two competing epistemologies in Life and August, and that those epistemologies are an epistemology of race and an epistemology of sexuality that obviously intersect in Joe's identity. While he worries that he might really be Black, he's actually also very much worried about whether or not he's a proper heterosexual. And of course, it culminates in the violence of a lynching scene where he is castrated, and there's all sorts of homoerotic tropes there that like James Baldwin later pick up on, like Going to Meet the Man. And I think that what we're seeing there is Faulkner not able to articulate queer identities, because when he tries to, they're running headlong into racial constructions, and he himself is actually more anxious and thought about heterosexuality. And what we have is, I mean, brilliant art that absolutely indicts the Southern system of gender. But that Southern system of gender cannot be seen outside of race, nor can race be seen outside of gender. They just start to, for the 30s, it just becomes like a whole other book to write about how this queer moment in Faulkner's life, the second queer phase, it's not inchoate, but it's just so tied to so much else in ways that it's not as explicitly tied to in the 20s or in the 40s, when frankly the book is about a white cis gay male identity. There is certainly room to write about non-cis identities and lesbian identities and bisexualities and other LGBTQ identities as they emerge in Faulkner's writing or in any writing. But for the book, there is simply so much to pick apart from a fairly, like, just let's look at relatively cisgender gay men, white gay men who Faulkner is connecting himself to. And that became, I got 140,000 words. To try to also then add on race needs to be done. And I very much want to see projects extend out to that. But it's taking a new epistemology and another epistemology, thinking through it that way. So I always answer long form too. Sorry.
No,
the answer to my question would never be yes.
Well, it's also it's also so it seems fitting that this topic in Faulkner studies and in modernism in general that has been marginalized for so long. As you say, there's like Faulkner criticism up until yesterday was super conservative.
Yeah.
That he is elevated by a conservative movement in literary criticism with the Southern agrarians. And that what you're doing, like part of what this book does is it takes something that was marginal in Faulkner studies and something that's marginal in Faulkner's own canon, which is the early work and the late work, and it elevates them to the status of something that we all need to know and talk about and say the words of Faulkner's early work. Are there any questions that? Okay. Well, maybe I can just ask you one more that is about that conservative strain in. No, I'm gonna get you in trouble with
Oh, it's okay. The Faulknerians have more or less already decided they love or hate me, so I'm not going to
Yeah.
let anyone do. You know,
Well, but I am wondering what, I guess to bring it back to A Rose for Emily, so you asked why it's so widely taught, and especially in high school, and it's something that I know I always teach in introduction to literature classes, and I learned it in high school. I learned it in my own introduction to literature classes, and it was always taught foremost. The reason people read it is because it teaches you about narrative time and uneven chronology without any notion of the actual politics of the story. And so I guess what I'd like you to talk about is just that how the response has been from a conservative Faulkner studies cohort of people, how this work has been received.
The work has been very well received amongst Faulknerians that I'm aware of, at least. If they're talking smack, they're not talking smack to me. But they're like amongst other Faulkner folks that sort of my cohort generally, folks studying Southern literature. We all assumed that it would get a lot more pushback, and maybe because it was published right before the pandemic occurred, that sort of distracted people in the scholarly world where scholarship wasn't always in the like people weren't jonesing to write their next article or they're going to like take on something. At this point, I have not received that much pushback. However, what I excised from the book, that the 20,000 words that went from 160 to 140 was actually places where like still active Faulkner scholars have previously written on queer themes in ways that are deeply problematic and homophobic. And my original draft, I wanted to be very clear about that. But then I realized that the book stands on its own. I don't need to like spend my time explaining why what this guy wrote this article 10 years ago is deeply problematic. Let's just make this argument and not touch on that. And I think that was a good decision because now the book itself is not trying to scream at old Faulkner scholars and tell them they did wrong. It's just presenting its argument on its face. Maybe that's why the pushback has not materialized. Maybe though we are, generally speaking, moving into an understanding of Faulkner. There is a long discussion right now that's been bubbling for a while in Faulkner about his continued relevance as a white male writer who, even if we want to argue that he is better than his generation on race, is still not to be praised in our contemporary context as we think about like Black Lives Matter movements and reassess the nature of the canon. So maybe what I'm writing is sort of falling under the radar to an extent because there is just a general moment right now in Faulkner studies where people recognize that if it continues the way that it has, we will make Faulkner obsolete ourselves. And we need to branch out and think more broadly. Since the book came out, the new project on trans studies in Faulkner, actually, I presented 3 different conferences, a keynote, and 2 presentations on trans Faulkner over the course of the last year, starting to sort of stake a claim to it and sketch out a broad outline for what it would be. And at the Faulkner Yoknapatawpha Conference this summer, via Zoom, conferences were, I delivered at that setting, which is enormously conservative Faulkner critics who really do like defend their notion
those
of
high school teachers that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I delivered a paper connecting, in this case, Eula, not Eula, the daughter, Linda Stokes Cole, to like a breaking down of gender identities that can be read along non-binary lines as something productive and not afraid of gender becoming blurry and not so rigidly defined, and tied it to trans studies and explored some new works in trans studies and tried to present them to a Faulkner audience. And an attendee, a very well established scholar in her own right and a real giant in the field, sent me a private message that simply said, "I am glad I was alive long enough to hear this at a Faulkner conference." And that's the type of thing that when someone says it to you, you're like, "Oh, I was just like trying to get a CV line out of this. I didn't know that I was like, the culmination of your desires as a Faulknerian before you die." Well, I'm a little flattered, thanks, kind of thing. And those are the types of responses I've had, as if by someone, aiming towards queer Faulkner in a way that sort of just blows what has been done aside. So no, let's do it this new way and move forward. It's like there's been like a sigh of relief, like, okay, I wanted to see someone do this. I just never had sort of the interest of pursuing it this far, nor knew how, so I just didn't invest that effort. You did. I'm glad this exists now. And that's been the biggest response. And obviously, as a writer at all, that's incredibly flattering. And really, like, as I was saying to some friends last night, I presented last night at Delta State University, and afterwards we were chatting, and I just sort of, there have been moments in these last, 2 years almost since the book's come out, when I paused. When I wrote the book, you get so into writing it that, like, it's published, and you're just like, I'm done. I don't want to talk about it anymore. But as I thought about what the book is and what its appeal is, yeah, I'm very proud of how it's doing more than I originally saw it. That I just wanted to sort of, like, I was determined to, like, no, he can be read as gay. Turns into something that feels, again, when I get emails from a student or something, that feels like it's doing so much more for people. Well, last note on that, I mean, I got a random email at the end of last spring semester from a Faulkner reader, just enthusiast in, I believe, Holland, Belgium, who simply said that as a gay man, he had always been drawn to Faulkner and never understand why. And literally said that reading my book made him cry several times because he was just so happy. And I'm like, I swear, I'm just like a very, very boring academic at a small university in Wisconsin. You don't actually have to offer me that kind of praise. Like, I don't know what to say. So some of that has been the reaction, which has been obviously wonderful, but I was expecting a different reaction, and that's not the case.
Well, you're bringing into the world that you want.
Yeah, there you go.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Dr. Gordon, for